This conference will now be recorded.
Hi class, and thank you for joining me. Today we're going to talk about the central nervous system and focus on the spinal cord and brain and areas of the brain and what they control and kind of some overview of how that works. This is all coming from your textbook, Anatomy and Physiology for the Manual Therapist. We're going over pages 187 to 195. All right. So I also like to include the summary videos. This is from Crash Course. You can check it out on your own. It will give you a nice overview. It'll probably feel like a lot of information before you've actually read the chapter or watched this lecture. You can go back to it after you learn the material to give you a quick refresher and kind of keep your brain sharp, say for prepping for a test or an exam. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The brain obviously is housed in the cranium or the skull. It's the control center. It maintains homeostasis for all functions of the body. It is the governor. It's the most important part. Within reason, of our body, right? Our brain controls everything, and homeostasis is regulated by this, and that's hugely important. The spinal cord is like an extension off the brain. It connects the body to the brain, taking in sensory information from our outer world, and relaying that information back to the higher brain centers to interpret those sensations and come up with a plan of action of how that motor response should go. Essentially what I'm talking about here is the reflex arc, and we talk about this again later on in this unit. The reflex arc basically has a few components, including sensory receptors, right? Picking up changes in the environment, which is called stimuli. That information is passed towards the spinal cord up sensory nerves, where there it's integrated either at the spine level or involving the higher brain centers. Finally, a motor impulse is sent back down through the spinal cord out of peripheral nerves and ending up in an effector site, which could be a muscle or a gland, and having some kind of effect there. That is what a reflex arc is. So a few things that we need to establish is the central nervous system is very important, and it's kind of just floating around in the center of our body in cerebrospinal fluid. We also have protective coverings over our brain, which is the skull, hard bony masses. In infants, the skull bones aren't yet completely formed, and this is to allow for the passage through the birth canal, and then allowing for the brain as it grows. The skull doesn't confine it, and it can actually expand with the growing brain. The vertebral column in the spine is what's protecting the spinal cord. It fits within the central vertebral canal, and all of the spinal cord nerves, the peripheral nerves, spinal nerves, are coming out of foramen, out of the spinal cord. The vertebral column. Meninges are membranes that protect the brain and spinal cord. They're continuous throughout. You can kind of think of the brain and the spinal cord as one continuous structure with these layers of meninges covering it. Provides physical stability. You don't want the spinal cord or brain moving around too much. That can actually cause spinal shock or some other malfunctions of the central nervous system. Like I mentioned, the brain and the spinal cord are just floating around within your body in the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid is circulating through the meninges and the spinal cord, as well as the brain ventricles. It's there as a shock absorbent. There's also involvement with the blood-brain barrier, and we're going to talk about that later on in the class, on how the brain doesn't directly receive blood. It's not saturated or sitting in any blood. The cerebrospinal fluid actually comes into close contact with a few vascular structures where that exchange of materials can occur. The blood-brain barrier is very selective of what can actually cross that membrane. Because the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, are so vulnerable and essential to our life, the body has a mechanism built in that makes it very hard for pathogens and infectious pathogens to enter our body and gain access to our central system. There are a few things that can pass through the blood-brain barrier, and we're going to talk about those. The cerebrospinal fluid, like I mentioned, is that medium for nutrient and waste exchange. It doesn't get direct access to blood. It passes the nutrients into the cerebrospinal fluid and then passes the waste products from the neurons, because neurons are just cells that eat, right, and poop and pee, and they have waste, and they need to actually exchange that. Maintaining proper ion concentrations is hugely important with the function of the nervous system, and having malfunction in this way, it can give rise to many mental illnesses. Okay, so the meninges that I mentioned before is one of the parts of the system that protects the central nervous system. So we have 3 meninges, and in order from the most outside or superficial to the most deep is how we're going to layer these. So the dura mater is the outer layer, and it literally translates to tough mother. It's 2 layers, okay, that have a gap in between to form something called the dural venous sinus. This is where blood and cerebrospinal fluid can drain. If you pay attention to the layers here, you can see you have the skull, the skin layer is over top of the skull, and underneath directly to the bone, you can see the dura mater, the outer layer and the inner layer with a gap. And this is where you have the dural sinuses, where your blood vessels can be present. But then you also have an interesting structure called the arachnoid villi and the superior sagittal sinus. And this is where the cerebrospinal fluid is actually reabsorbed back into the bloodstream, which becomes very important. We're going to talk about it a little bit later when we are discussing the circulation of cerebrospinal fluid. The arachnoid villi, which are these projections into the superior sagittal sinus between the 2 layers of the dura mater, is where that exchange occurs, where cerebrospinal fluid is returned back into the blood system. The arachnoid matter is the middle layer, and it has the subarachnoid space, which is most interesting because cerebrospinal fluid directly circulates in this region of the dura mater, of the meninges. It's called subarachnoid space because it literally looks like spider webs underneath the arachnoid matter. Little projections there. And then finally, the most inner layer is called the pia mater, and it covers the spinal cord and the brain directly. So maybe you've heard of meningitis. ITIS always means some sort of inflammation, so it's literally inflammation of the meninges. Inflammation of the meninges will be caused by some sort of infectious agent, whether it's bacterial, viral, fungal, or parasitic. It results in inflammation of the meninges, and the signs and symptoms are high fever, okay, severe headache, rash, stiff neck, and others. I highlighted headache and stiff neck because those are things that would present to a manual therapist. However, the high fever indicates that there is an infection happening, okay, and that would make it, I guess I should have highlighted high fever as well, but high fever, headache, and stiff neck would be red flag symptoms of maybe there's something more serious going on here. Now that we live in the pandemic, nobody is showing up to your clinic with a high fever, so they should be immediately referred to the hospital. But meningitis does present with that stiff neck, irritation of the meninges with any neck movement because of the meninges of the brain and the spinal cord being so inflamed. Trying to move the neck of the individual will be quite challenging, and it will appear off. But anyways, a manual therapist should always rule out meningitis in clients with these symptoms, and really if you're not sure or you suspect that meningitis is occurring, particularly with that high fever, stiff neck, and headache, that needs to be referred to a physician immediately. Okay, more on the brain blood flow and the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so even though the brain only makes up about 2% of your total body weight, it requires 20% of your total blood oxygen. The brain is greedy. It feeds itself before anyone else because it takes priority. Without the brain, nothing else at all can function. So the brain needs a lot of glucose or sugar and oxygen to do what it needs to do. And you have pathology when neither of these things can gain access to the brain. The brain will develop severe damage if it's deprived of oxygen for 4 minutes or longer. The brain receives the blood supply through the internal carotid artery and the vertebral arteries that carry the blood to the brain. And then the blood is returned back to the heart through the internal jugular veins. So like I mentioned, the blood-brain barrier is there to protect the brain from harmful substances like pathogens or the toxins that pathogens produce, or even toxins from the environment. We talked about glial cells in a previous lecture, but astrocytes are a glial cell. Glial cells are nervous tissue or nervous cells that aren't neurons, okay? They have no conducting ability. They're more there for support. So astrocytes will tightly seal around blood capillaries in this region of the brain. And so that creates that barrier so nothing can get through. It's nice and tightly sealed. This picture below is kind of schematic drawing. It's a cross section of a capillary. Okay, so we can see the lumen of the blood vessel, and then the blue pieces are representing astrocytes, which are tightly sealed all around. The other lighter images here, you might not even be able to see it on your screen, but on your own PowerPoint, you can probably see it. These are just neurons that are innervating the blood vessel. So things that can cross the blood-brain barrier are lipid-soluble substances or fat-soluble substances. These include oxygen, carbon dioxide, pretty important, right, with that exchange of nutrients and waste. Alcohol also crosses the blood-brain barrier quite easily. I mean, I think it's no surprise as how alcohol can affect the functioning of the brain quite rapidly. Anesthesia can also cross the blood-brain barrier, and essential oils, which is important for a manual therapist as that can be utilized in a treatment room. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So just a drawing to remind you of the important blood vessels that supply the brain. I'm not testing you on this directly, but you should be aware of it, as when you're massaging somebody on the neck, there are really important structures, and you don't want to deprive the brain of any blood. So we have the common carotid artery and the internal carotid arteries and the external carotid arteries. And it's the internal carotid artery that's actually important, in the next slide, to connect to the circle of Willis. The circle of Willis is actually a inferior view of the base of the brain. So it's almost like you took the brain and you're looking underneath it, and there's this really unique circular blood vessel pattern located in this region. And why I want to highlight it to you is I'm not going to ask you about the different branches at all or how blood flows through this circle of Willis, but we will be coming to talk about strokes and aneurysms, and I just want to highlight that this is the vulnerable section of the brain where these types of things occur, right? So I want you to kind of imagine the brain. The brain doesn't have blood vessels all interdispersed in it. It's all in the dura mater. And the blood supply to the brain is coming from underneath from the carotid arteries and then feeding into the circle of Willis. So you can actually see the internal carotid arteries here. They're cut from this demonstration that connect to the circle of Willis. Circle of Willis is interesting because if one section is disrupted, there's still an opportunity to go the other way to still create blood perfusion, although the direct area over here is going to be damaged if that was where it occurred. So yeah, just keep that in mind when we talk about strokes, aneurysms, and different cerebral vascular accidents in pathology. Okay, and then for venous blood return, again, it's just the internal jugular connecting to the subclavian and the superior vena cava for the blood return back to the heart. Oh, I also wanted to highlight in this picture, it's kind of cool, the superior sagittal sinus. Okay, you can see this blood vessel at the very top of the head of the brain. And we talked about it over here, this superior sagittal sinus. We're getting it from a frontal view. Yeah, frontal view, I believe. And you can see this gap in the dura mater right here where venous blood is returning, right, is pooling. And from that superior sagittal sinus, the blood is actually returning back to the heart. And remember that arachnoid villi, that's a projection that holds the cerebrospinal fluid. So there's that exchange of waste materials leaving the arachnoid villi into the superior sagittal sinus, which then is finally returning back to the heart through the venous blood return. So cerebrospinal fluid, what is it? It's made up of blood plasma. So remember from the cardiovascular unit last year, we were talking about what blood plasma is, and if we took a blood sample, and we put it in a test tube in a centrifuge that spun it around very rapidly, you get the sedimentation at the bottom, which is all of your proteins and blood cells. You have a buffy coat, which is your white blood cells, and then the rest of it is the plasma, or the majority of it is the plasma. Plasma is just the water that's contained in the blood. So this plasma is what's circulating through the cavities in the brain. They're called ventricles. So there's these structures in the brain that actually produce cerebrospinal fluid and circulate it around the brain and the spinal cord. What I want you to know about this is that the cerebrospinal fluid actually circulates through the cavities in the brain called the ventricles, but also the central canal of the spinal cord, which I will also highlight to you when we get more into the anatomy of the spinal cord. But the central canal is a hollow center all through the center of the spinal cord. So the cerebrospinal fluid can actually infiltrate the central spine and then also the outer portions of the spine and the brain. So inside, outside brain. And then also the cerebrospinal fluid can be found in the subarachnoid space of the meninges. The cerebrospinal fluid is supposed to be there to absorb shock and protect the brain and the spinal cord, while also transporting nutrients, oxygen and glucose, and then the waste away from the blood and the nervous tissue. Okay, so the formation and circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid in the ventricles. So we already talked about how cerebrospinal fluid is returned back into the blood through the venous pathway, right? Through the arachnoid villi in that superior sagittal sinus. How cerebrospinal fluid is brought into the system is through the choroid plexus, okay? These are a specialized structure of a network of capillaries that are found in the walls of ventricles. And the ventricles are all lined by special cells or glial cells, again, called ependymal cells. This picture is showing a single layer of ependymal cells with a bunch of villi on the inner surface of the ventricles. Okay, so the ventricles are a hollow space that's holding the cerebrospinal fluid, and the ependymal cells that are lining the ventricles are actually secreting the cerebrospinal fluid. And then they have little tails or villi on them that actually beats the fluid across the surface, circulating it around the brain and the spinal cord. So it's the plasma portion of the blood that's actually drawn from the choroid plexus through the ependymal cells into the ventricles to produce cerebrospinal fluid. So it's the water from the blood, but not necessarily the blood cells and everything that's larger in the blood. So this is a medium of transmission from the blood into the cerebrospinal fluid to allow for that nutrient exchange. And like I mentioned before, cerebrospinal fluid is reabsorbed back into the blood by the arachnoid villi. Okay, so moving to the spinal cord of the central nervous system. The role of the spinal cord is to relay information between the brain and the body. The spinal cord serves as the body's primary reflex center. Okay, so it is receiving input from the sensory receptors and the sensory nerves, and then releasing motor output to the effector tissues, whether that be muscle or glands. Like I mentioned, it's located in the vertebral foramen of the spinal column, and it starts at the foramen magnum, which is the opening at the inferior portion of the skull, and extends all the way to L2. Okay, at L2, okay, so at every vertebral foramen, there is a segment which releases a spinal nerve, and there's 31 pairs of spinal nerves. We did talk about that already. And then at L2, we have the quada equini, which is an elongated nerve roots of L3 to the coccygeal nerve that angle inferiorly and kind of appear like a horsetail. Okay, but the spinal cord actually stops at around L2, and that's why lumbar punctures or epidurals are done in this region, because there's no spinal cord tissue just spinal nerves, and it's much easier to get a sample of cerebrospinal fluid in this way or inject medications in this way without the lowest possible risk of having any damage to the spinal cord. The spinal cord contains white and gray matter. White matter is composed of myelinated axons. Myelin is like a fatty tissue, and it's insulating the axons of neurons, and have that appearance of white. They're organized into bundles of nerves called tracts, and these tracts can be either ascending or descending. Ascending tracts are going to be traveling up, okay, up the spinal cord into the brain, while descending tracts are going to be coming from the brain and moving down the spinal cord. Okay, so that's important to note because one is sensory information, one is motor information, and the direction of that is always the same. Sensory information is always moving its way up into the spinal cord and brain, and motor information is traveling from the brain down the spinal cord and out of the spinal nerves. Gray matter, on the other hand, is composed of unmyelinated axons, cell bodies of neurons, dendrites, and glial cells. Okay, the cross section or transverse section of a spinal cord has this like butterfly shape appearance of the gray matter embedded and surrounded by the white matter. So the butterfly shape has a few horns on it. Okay, so when we're looking at it, there is a posterior gray horn, an anterior gray horn, and a lateral gray horn, right? And different things are happening in each of these horns. Yeah, okay. The posterior portion of the spinal cord is receiving sensory information, okay? So the posterior gray horn is a somatic sensory area and a visceral sensory area. Okay, so that means information from the body and information from the organs is being retrieved into the posterior gray horn of the spinal cord. And so tracts of the for the sensory information is going to be moving into this white matter and then moving up into the brain. The brain receives this input, makes a conscious decision about what motor function it wants to employ or do, and it will send descending tracts down through the white matter as well on the anterior portion of the spinal cord, and then will make synapses in the anterior gray horn, which will then travel down into the peripheral nerves to whatever effector organ that will be. Lateral gray horns we will talk about when we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, and we aren't discussing that today, but just so you're aware, that's what that's part of. So don't get confused between horns and roots. Horns are on the gray matter when you look at the butterfly or the transverse section of a spinal cord. The nerve roots are kind of on the outside of the spinal cord because they are actually connecting nerve fibers of each spinal nerve to the respective cord segment. All right, so this picture is showing a portion of a spinal cord. It has been sliced in a transverse section, so we can actually see that butterfly shape, but we can see more of the spinal cord. We can actually see the different layers of meninges, the hard dura matter on the outside, the arachnoid matter underneath that, and then the pia matter more deep to of all of the meninges. We can see the white matter and then the gray matter embedded into it in that butterfly-shaped pattern. We can visualize the posterior gray horn and the anterior gray horn and the lateral gray horn. We can see the central canal that's right smack dab in the center of the circular structure, and it actually travels the entire length of the spinal cord. So cerebral spinal fluid can actually penetrate the middle part of the spinal cord. Now for nerve roots, we have the dorsal root, okay, or the posterior root. Those names are interchangeable, so they could be used in an exam or test. You know that dorsal and posterior are the exact same thing. Pay attention to root, because that means we're talking about the actual nerve fibers rather than just the gray matter within the spinal cord itself, okay? So the posterior dorsal root is housing the sensory tracts, okay? Always the same. Posterior is always sensory, anterior is always motor. The posterior dorsal root also has a dorsal root ganglion, which is unique for the dorsal side or the sensory side. There's a little, it appears as a little bubble or bulge, okay, in that posterior dorsal root. And this is, excuse me, is actually containing the cell bodies of sensory neurons, okay, and that's why it's a little bit enlarged. The anterior or ventral root is the one in the front and actually has motor tracts or descending tracts. The dorsal and the ventral roots join up to create the spinal nerve, okay, that then finally leaves the spinal cord and the vertebral column through the intervertebral foramen, which is, we can see a segment of the vertebral column here with the vertebral bodies and the spinous processes, as well as the transverse processes and the articulations, which is leaving an empty space called the intervertebral foramen, where the spinal nerves will actually extend out to travel the distance of your body to wherever the effector is. And we also have, I want you to pay attention to the pieces in between the vertebral bodies, which are the discs, okay? The spinal cord vertebral discs. And this is important because if you have degenerative disc disease or somebody with degenerative disc disease or herniated discs, this will have a role to play on possible symptoms that they're experiencing. So if you have a person with degenerative disc disease and there is compression on a disc, you may end up having a smaller opening of the intervertebral foramen, and this can cause encroachment on a spinal nerve that is extending out, right? So it's causing a little bit of irritation, and that can present as numbness and tingling or muscle weakness, and is a different pathology than, say, a nerve impingement due to a nerve being trapped under some tense muscles, as in piriformis syndrome, where you actually have the sciatic nerve being impinged between the muscles. This is a little bit different because it's happening at the most proximal aspect of that spinal nerve, at the spinal column, at the vertebral column, due to the discs being narrow and changing the anatomy slightly, causing the encroachment on the nerve and some nerve irritation and inflammation in that way. So as a manual therapist, it's a good idea to be aware of the cause of the pain. If somebody is having numbness, tingling, or muscle weakness, where in the body is that nerve being pinched? I guess you could think about it that way. And that's where a good assessment by measuring dermatomes and myotomes and doing all of the necessary evaluations can help narrow down what might be the possible pathology. Even though you're not diagnosing anyone, having that awareness, you have more knowledge than the client coming in. And so if you're finding that their issue isn't muscular in nature, that impingement isn't happening due to soft structures, it's more to hard structures in the spinal cord, that would be something you'd want to refer them to their physician to, discuss further options, because the massage might not be as effective for those symptoms. I just wanted to give you a little visual about that reflex arc again. When we're talking about the gray horns, as well as the ascending and descending tracts, and the dorsal and ventral roots. So when we're starting with the reflex arc here, there's some kind of a sensory receptor picking up changes in the environment, and it's relaying that information up the sensory neuron. Here we can actually see the cell bodies of the sensory neuron, right? And then the synapses of the sensory neuron on the interneuron is happening at the posterior gray horn. The synapses on the motor neuron are happening at the anterior gray horn. But I also want you to note that within the spinal cord itself, you're having synapses on interneurons and also crossing over the spinal cord, okay, so that the messages actually reach the opposite side of the brain. The sensory neurons are going to extend into the white matter in those tracts I told you about and move up towards the brain, where motor or descending tracts are going to be moving away from the brain within the white matter on the anterior aspect, and then crossing over into the anterior gray horn where its synapses on another motor neuron, leading to the effector. Neurons, even though they're a single cell, can be many feet long and can reach all the way from the spinal cord to whatever effector that would be. And in this example, it's skeletal muscle. Later on, we'll be talking about the autonomic nervous system, and you can see the lateral gray horn is where that neuron starts, and it is feeding, the motor neuron is actually feeding visceral organs, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. I mentioned already dermatomes and myotomes, and we may have talked about this in the skin section. I know that you'll probably be talking about this with Dale. It's part of a clinical evaluation and can give a clinician a lot of information. So a dermatome relates to an area of the skin that's innervated by sensory fibers from a specific single spinal nerve. And so when you're doing an evaluation of dermatomes, you're comparing both sides of the body with touch, okay? And the client is giving you information about changes or alterations in the sensation of your touch. So if one side feels different than the other. And then with further evaluation, you can actually isolate it by looking at a very predictable map, which is in this picture here, of what spinal nerve is related to that portion of skin. So if you have a dysfunctional sensation somewhere, you can actually identify what segment of the spinal cord might have impairment. Like I talked about before with degenerative disc disease, you can very accurately figure out where that spinal nerve encroachment is occurring depending on what dermatome is affected. Myotomes is a muscle or group of muscles that are innervated by a single spinal segment. So together with a dermatome can give you more information about what is going on, right? So for example, if a client's coming in, they're telling you that they're having numbness and tingling in their hands, through your evaluation, you can actually tell whether or not it's a nerve impingement, at the wrist because of carpal tunnel syndrome, or if it's maybe more related to thoracic outlet syndrome with an impingement in the neck and shoulder, or if it's actually due to a disc herniation, a bulging disc, or some kind of disc disease at the cervical spine. Viscerotome is an innervation of organs by a spinal nerve, and clinically you don't evaluate that. But even though you're not evaluating it, you can still use this therapeutically to know what spinal cord segment is affected and what organ, right, that spinal nerve may be innervating, right, and have an effect on that. And that's a huge aspect of like chiropractic therapies, but also manual therapy can be similar, right? Having muscle tension on a specific level of the spinal cord and being able to work that region can help to highlight and maybe relieve and improve innervation of certain organs. I know in my practice, I do this a lot with acupuncture, where I'm using back shoe points along the paraspinals to innervate and activate spinal nerves coming out of the spinal cord to actually tonify organs for a desired effect therapeutically. So the brain has 4 major regions that you need to know. One is the brainstem, 2 is the diencephalon. So the brainstem is an extension of the spinal cord, okay, including, it's like our primitive brain. The diencephalon sits right on top of that, okay, it's like a relay center. The cerebrum, which is the biggest part of the brain and all the folds and what we kind of think about when we think of the brain. And then the cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain, and it's just posterior to the brain stem and a little inferior to the cerebrum. And it has a lot to do with our coordination, our equilibrium, and our balance. We're going to break down each of these regions. So the brainstem has 3 parts itself. It's important for relaying information. It's a junction point. It has 3 parts, listing them from the most inferiorly to superiorly. So the medulla oblongata is an extension off the spinal cord. It is the section here highlighted in purple. On top of it is the pons, which is the orange portion. And then the midbrain is this pink area. Okay, the brain isn't actually these colors, but for the sake of learning, they are color-coded. You can see an anterior or dorsal view, and you can also see a mid-sagittal section here to see how they're located within the brain. The corpus callosum is the bridge between the right and the left hemisphere, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I just wanted to point that out. We also have, we can see the really cool arbor vitae, which is a term you don't have to know, but it kind of looks like a tree at the cerebellum, sorry. And yeah, we can also see the pituitary gland here, the pineal gland, and we'll talk about some of those structures later when we get to the next part of the brain. But for now, we're going to focus on the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Okay, so the brainstem is the medulla oblongata as the most inferior aspect. 90% of the tracts that are ascending, sensory tracts here, that are ascending to the brain will cross at this region, okay, in the medulla oblongata. And this is called the defasciation of pyramids, where there's the most crossing happening. And that's why you can have left-brained and right-brained people. They say that people who are right-handed are left-brained people. They're more analytical, logical, scientific, mathematical, where people who are right-brained tend to be more artistic and creative. The term nuclei will come up a lot while we're talking about the brain. And basically, a nuclei is a group of synapsing neurons. Okay, so it's an area where there's a lot of neurons connecting to each other, and they create very distinct regions in the brain that can be scanned and visualized for diagnostic purposes. The medulla oblongata, and this is important, houses two main centers. The medullary rhythmicity center, which is regulating breathing, and the cardiovascular center, which is monitoring and adjusting heart rate and the diameter of blood vessels for blood pressure. This is really important for life, right? If there is damage to the medulla oblongata, the brain can actually trigger, will fail to breathe or for the heart to function properly, and then that can cause death. This is of particular concern or threat to boxers, as like a very powerful uppercut can actually cause damage to the medulla oblongata, or a blow to the back of the neck, a very strong blow to the back of the neck can actually disrupt these centers and cause an instantaneous death. The other two areas of the brainstem that we're going to talk about are the pons and the midbrain. The pons translates to bridge. It basically is a connection of the spinal cord, the cerebrum, and the cerebellum. The midbrain is connecting the brainstem to the Diencephalon, which is another area of the brain. And it houses the substantia nigra, which translates to black substance. It is also a nuclei. We'll be talking about this in pathology, but it's important because it produces and releases the neurotransmitter dopamine. And dopamine is our reward neurotransmitter, right? We keep doing something because of dopamine. It makes us feel good. Dopamine is also really important for smooth, rhythmic, motor function. And when there's less dopamine being synthesized and released to stimulate the basal ganglia, which is actually, basal ganglia is a center or region in the cerebrum, okay, so higher brain center, you're gonna have some issues. And this is actually what Parkinson's disease is. There's a deterioration of the substantia nigra, and so there isn't enough dopamine being released to actually stimulate the basal ganglia. So you end up having symptoms of like severe muscle tension, facial masking, and tremors. And those with Parkinson's disease have to take a medication that increases their dopamine levels. The reticular formation is also found in the midbrain and the brain stem. It's a mix of gray and white matter and has both ascending and descending tracts. The reticular formation in the sensory part or sensory function of this has to do with maintaining an alert state or attention. And this is referred to as the reticular activating center, or the RAS. The motor portion of the reticular formation is involved in just regulating resting muscle tension or muscle tone. which is also really important, right? You don't want to just have like all of a sudden get floppy, right? We won't be able to sit or maintain a posture. Yeah. Okay, so we're moving to another region of the brain, and this is called the Diencephalon. There's three structures here: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland. So first of all, the thalamus, as depicted in this picture, are two oval-shaped masses. And its importance and significance is that it acts as a filter. It acts as a filter because it receives all of the sensory input from the body, okay? And if your cortex or your cerebrum had to interpret all of this sensory input, it would be quite overwhelming. So what the thalamus does is it takes all the sensory information and only allows the significant input to get to the conscious levels of our brain. So it basically, yeah, it's just filtering out unimportant signals, sensory information. And if the sensory info is deemed important, it gets sent into a main sensory region of the brain. The hypothalamus of the diencephalon is found just inferior to the thalamus, hypothalamus, okay? And it is the primary connection between the nervous and the endocrine system. Remember, both the nervous system and the endocrine system are part of regulating homeostasis, and this is where there's that direct connection. The pituitary gland is really important as it secretes hormones that regulates other aspects of the endocrine system, which we'll talk about. It is also the main control center for the autonomic nervous system. The hypothalamus regulates circadian rhythm, which is like your wake and sleep cycles, consciousness, body temperature, hunger, thirst, emotions like anger, and also a major area for pain and pleasure. We will be talking far much more about the pituitary gland when we are into the endocrine system, but for now, just be aware that this is the major connection between the nervous and endocrine system. Pituitary gland, definitely need to know that and what it does. The diencephalon is the pineal gland. Has the pineal gland. Sometimes it's called the epithalamus, but in your textbook, they're just calling it pineal gland, so that's what we'll be referring to it as. So you can see the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the pineal gland. So don't get confused between pituitary gland and pineal gland, right? They kind of sound the same. But the pineal gland is found more posteriorly, where the pituitary gland is more inferior and anterior. The pineal gland has a significance historically to it. They don't really know why, but it's kind of the gateway to the kind of an altered reality, because melatonin, which is released or secreted from the pineal gland, promotes sleepiness and connects us into the dream world. So if you've ever taken melatonin as a supplement, maybe you've noticed that your dreams are a little bit more vivid. And then historically, there's a lot of artwork that is highlighting the pineal gland, right, as the third eye. The pineal gland, interestingly enough, has tissue that resembles an eye, like a retina, which is interesting because in the middle, smack dab in the middle of a brain, light is not accessing this area. So why would there be retinal tissue in this gland? It's still a mystery. They don't exactly know why, just like a lot of the brain. They don't understand it and all its complexity, but yeah, historically, they will represent the pineal gland as the pine cone, okay, pineal gland, and the third eye. So just some historical artwork there for you. It is also another link between the nervous and the endocrine system, but it's not the primary link, okay? The pituitary gland is. The cerebellum, which is the second largest part of the brain, it has two hemispheres, right and left, and it's located at the posterior inferior aspect of the brain, and posterior to the brain stem. The cerebellum is involved in like subconscious skeletal movement and coordination. It contributes to equilibrium and balance. And when it's affected, whether through disease or intoxication like, am I saying that right? Intoxication? I don't know why that sounds so weird to me right now. But alcohol use, okay, or drug use can cause impairment of the cerebellum and causing uncoordinated physical movements, as well as speech. And you can watch this really funny video. The very first time, maybe you've seen it already. I'm kind of always the last one to see these things, but when I saw this video, I almost peed my pants. I thought it was so hilarious. It's an example of a drunk driver who was pulled over and having to perform a sobriety test. Okay, so a sobriety test is going to test the cerebellum function, and can be a good indicator that somebody's under the influence. The gentleman who was pulled over in this video somehow is able to be quite coordinated, and you should check that out. It's really funny. It's good for a laugh. Okay, and then finally the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain. It is involving all the complex processes, including thinking, problem solving, learning, memory, emotions, but most importantly, for our purposes, sensory perception and motor planning with movement. Perception is defined as the mental process of becoming aware of and recognizing an object or an idea. Right? It kind of comes down to everything's perception because it can have a lot of connection and associations with past experiences, memories, and it's utilizing multiple sources of sensory information and integrating this information with input from the memory to decide or become aware of an object. Your textbook gives the example of recognizing a lemon, right? The visual receptors are picking up like yellow, some sort of a roundish shape and texture to the skin. The hands will be feeling that texture, feeling the shape of it. The smell, the olfactory nerves will pick up the scent of a lemon and will remind you of when you've also smelled that before. And that's how you're able to identify an object that you're holding with your eyes closed or eyes open, whatever. I use the eyes open, but multiple sources of sensory information to make up a perception. So it's detected by the body, right? Because it's all the sensory receptors that are not within the brain, but the information is relayed to the brain and the brain interprets all of this information at once. And so your textbook makes a point of saying that, you know, through touch, you can actually touch the mind, right? And give it a different perception or ideas or thoughts. And going into a therapy session with a client, that is important to be mindful of because your touch is interpreted by that individual's sensory receptors, and their sensory receptors are picking up information which is being interpreted by their brain or their mind. And you're a part of that because of how you are touching and how they're perceiving your touch. Each region of the brain is responsible for managing a specific sensory motor or associative function. Let's see here. Just 1 second. Yeah. So the area of the different areas of the brain, well, there's different lobes. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, but this picture is highlighting different regions where speech is interpreted, where visual centers are of the brain. I'm not going to ask you where they're located. I just need you to know that there are different regions of the brain for specific sensory or motor or associative functions. We're going to focus on the pre and post central gyri for our purposes, I believe. So a couple definitions with the cerebrum. The cerebral cortex is the outer rim of gray matter. You can see in this picture zoomed in of the cerebral cortex that you can see the darkened gray area just outlining the very edge of the brain. You can see the gyri, which are just folds. Okay, so the brain is quite large. It needs to fold in on itself in order to fit into your skull. And those folds are just called gyri or gyrus. A gyri is plural. Sulci are shallow grooves. So you can see the gyrus here. It's a fold, and the sulcus is a shallow groove, where a fissure, so we can see a longitudinal fissure here, is going quite deep. The longitudinal fissure is what separates the right and the left halves of the cerebrum, and we call that cerebral hemispheres. The corpus callosum connects these two cerebral hemispheres, and you can see it just at the base of this photo here, connecting the two. Yeah, we'll talk about it. There are 4 lobes of the cerebrum, and they're named for the area of overlying skull bones. So if you know your skull bones, you'll already know the lobes of the cerebrum. We have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Okay, and they are color coordinated in your diagrams to make it more simple, although the brain is all one color. I want you to pay attention to the central sulcus. Remember, sulcus is a more shallow groove, more shallow than, say, the fissure. The central sulcus, so the longitudinal fissure is dividing the right and the left halves of the brain, where the central sulcus is dividing up the anterior and posterior parts of the brain, or you could actually more accurately is separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Alrighty, so it's important because it's the center, and on the posterior side, you have a gyri or gyrus, a fold, and on the anterior side you also have a gyrus. The fold, so the central sulcus is separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The gyrus in the parietal lobe is where there is the primary somatosensory area. Okay, the post-central gyrus is the primary somatosensory area. What this means is all the sensory information that is coming into your spinal cord and brain stem, whether it be the pressure of the chair on your butt, the temperature of the air, other background noises, visual sensations, all the sensory information is coming into the thalamus, right? The thalamus is deciding which of these sensory inputs deserves the attention of your consciousness from the cerebrum. And if something is going to get filtered through and being sent up to the higher brain centers of the cerebrum from the thalamus, it's going to end up in this post-central gyrus, okay, in the parietal lobe. And that's where the main interpretation, perception of the sensory information is going to occur, all right? The precentral gyrus, the portion, the fold, the gyrus that's more anterior to the central sulcus and within the frontal lobe is your primary motor area. And this is where the brain, after interpreting that sensory information, will make a decision about the motor response. And that's where that signal starts. So the brain decides what it's going to do, and it sends information down the descending tracks in the white matter of the spinal column, right, to extend out through the peripheral nerve, spinal nerve, to whatever effector organ, muscle, gland, tissue it needs to do. Okay. Okay, we talked about the basal ganglia already, as it is important in Parkinson's disease, but I just want to touch on it a little bit here. The basal ganglia is made up of 3 nuclei, which are again masses of gray matter, and it's deep within the cerebral, each of the cerebral hemispheres, and has, you know, the 3 nuclei, which is the globus pallidus, the putamen, and the caudate nucleus. I won't ask you about them. I put them in italics, because it's, you know, they're terms that you could be familiar with, but I'm not going to ask you anything very specific about them. What you need to know about the basal ganglia is that it helps to initiate and terminate movements. It suppresses unwanted movements and regulates muscle tone. The limbic system is our emotional brain. It's a collection of structures, okay, that process memory and emotion and controls unconscious behavior. The definitions here, I would expect you to know the terms, the cingulate gyri, hippocampus, amygdala, and mammillary bodies may be testable. The cingulate gyri is adding an emotional content to sensory input and that perception of pain. You can kind of see this with kids when they fall on their butts. They kind of look around to see if anybody saw them, right? And then it kind of takes them a second to decide that it hurt, right? And that's the emotional content to the sensory input they're receiving. That them falling, tripping and falling, and falling on their butt has a emotional aspect to it. It's not just the pain, right, that they're crying about. The hippocampus is probably like the coolest place because it actually creates new memories, and they've proved more or less recently that new neurons can actually be synthesized here. They at one point, I mean, for a long time thought that you were born, you were given as many neurons, and if they died, that was it, right? You got no more. But they actually have found out that in the hippocampus, new neurons are actually being made, which is super cool. And I just included an article here as Harvard neuroscientists have been studying monks and how their brains work, and noticing and coming up with some really interesting observations about meditation and the ability to change your brain in this concept of neuroplasticity. And meditation is so cool because it's free. You can do it anywhere. It doesn't just reduce stress, but it can actually reconfigure how your brain works. The amygdala of the limbic system mediates the overall emotional response by comparing sensory data with memories. So, yeah, memory of an experience can have an emotional response to it, even though that's not occurring at that moment. The mammillary bodies are related to the olfactory information or the sense of smell. It's just like when you walk into a room and you have this powerful smell, it brings you back, right, to grandma's kitchen, or when you've made that dish before, or if takes you back to a certain season or time in your life because of a scent. Which is cool because it affects the limbic system. It affects the emotions. So there's a very strong tie to sense of smell and emotion and memory. And that's through the mammillary body of the limbic system. So the alarm response and aromatherapy, we're going to touch more about the alarm response moving forward with the autonomic nervous system and even the endocrine system. But when an individual is frightened due to some surprise or some threat, it's going to be registered in the amygdala, and that communicates with the hypothalamus. This sets off a series of unconscious physiological responses to prepare the body for action in that flight or fight setting that we have. The opposite is rest and digest. So when we're frightened, unconsciously, we are triggered into this physiological response to prepare our body to deal with that. And this is happening before we're even consciously aware of it. So a couple of things that happen is our pupils dilate. We have increased respiration and heart rate to actually get the blood pumping, a lot more oxygenation to the tissue so that they can perform at superhuman strength, run really fast or fight really hard, be really strong. The cerebrum consciously perceives the emotion to determine the conscious response, but this happens after the actual physiological response occurs. In other kinds of neurologic conditions like anxiety, it actually could be the opposite, where the thoughts, the automatic thoughts that come up trigger an emotion and a physiological response, and they're all tied into each other. When you're trying to treat something like anxiety, you really have to pay attention to those negative automatic thoughts, or NATs as I call them, to challenge those thoughts and the underlying belief of those thoughts, to cut the cycle of the feelings, the emotions of fear, or, well, really anxiety is a fear is manifesting underneath that, right? The emotion of fear and body sensations that are also being interpreted, or as a result of that, the thoughts, the emotions, right? Then the body sensations can show up. Cognitive behavioral therapy is great for highlighting this for individuals. I mean, I think right now, with the state of everything, everybody's feeling a little bit of anxiety or anxiousness, and it really does start with a lot of the thought train, the thought patterns that we have, and I think of those as grooves, right? We get into a cycle of negative thinking, or a habit of negative thinking, and sometimes we just need that little bit of help or boost to kind of get off that track, right, and start treading a new track of how we're thinking and challenging the thoughts and beliefs that we have that may not be true. Like I mentioned with aromatherapy, the olfactory pathways are linked directly to the mammillary bodies in the limbic system, which can elicit a powerful emotional response, provoke memories, and can be a therapeutic tool for in the treatment room. Of course, you want to use this with caution, as those with allergies or sensitivities will not appreciate the aromatherapy the way you think they will. So always get consent and do a good intake to know if that's going to be triggering something for that client. Pathology alert, headaches. We will definitely be talking about this in more detail in pathology, but I just want to highlight that headaches are a major reason why an individual may come see a manual therapist. Chronic headaches can be debilitating. There are 3 general categories for headaches: stress or tension headaches, which are very successfully treated by manual therapists. Cluster headaches, which are just awful. Luckily, they're more rare. Cluster headaches tend to come on periodically and can be quite debilitating. And those individuals who actually deal with cluster headaches are more at risk for suicide because the pain is actually that debilitating. Migraine headaches also are more severe headaches that are one-sided, where stress or tension headaches tend to be bilateral or more like a squeezing pattern or a headband or behind the eyes, where a migraine headache will be one-sided or unilateral. A headache can also be a warning sign of a serious pathology. As a general rule, if it is the worst headache of their life or it's a different kind of headache, those types of things need to be evaluated by their physician. Yeah, and that's that. So that is the conclusion of your central nervous system lecture. I look forward to reviewing that with you. And yeah, and as we're moving forward, it looks like we only have a couple of more lectures in the nervous system until the holidays. After the holidays, we move into pathology. And yeah, our next review class, live review class, is December 10th online, and we'll be talking about that then. Just a reminder that you have a CBA that is out now that is due December 22nd with your proctor. Alrighty, have yourself a wonderful day and we will talk soon. Bye for now.